You are listening to the Iser Health Podcast with your host, Dr. Josh Gilden.
Disclaimer. The information discussed in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. Always consult with a qualified healthcare provider regarding a medical condition or treatment. The views expressed by the guests and hosts are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of any affiliated institutions.
As we're getting into this, we're talking to Rabbi Moshe Wiener, who is a renowned social worker here at Iser Health, and also a rabbi in his spare time, personal time. I don't know if a rabbi actually gets any personal time. In his other time, right?
Shabbos.
In his Shabbos, right, exactly. Which is obviously a big responsibility. I'm excited, and I mentioned this off camera about this conversation, because I find that the more the conversation is geared away from pure medicine, right, and I actually have less of a hold on it, I'm a little bit more excited to talk about it, because my level of interaction with social work is generally in the emergency department, right? So I work in a couple different emergency departments, and depending on where I work, the social worker is more or less involved, and sometimes the social requirements are a little bit higher, right? And when I say higher, I mean like shelter, finding someone shelter, finding someone a rehabilitation facility. And these are not easy things to do in that setting, and I really, really respect the social workers that I get to work with there, and like their upbeat attitude and just the level of communication that we have. Sometimes, this is ironic, I work with some consultants who are physicians. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes I speak to other fields about what's going on with the patient. But then I get to work with a social, and sometimes there's friction. Like there's a little bit of disagreement over the patient care, and that's natural, that's part of medicine. And then I get to talk to a social worker, and almost universally I get this upbeat person who there's no pushback. It's like, let's get this done attitude, let's be on the same page almost universally. And it's just such a pleasure, because in medicine, we always feel like we want to do the best thing for the patient by like physically doing something, an intervention. If someone has a laceration, sewing it shut, right? That kind of stuff. It's gratifying to some extent. But when you get to help someone in more of like this metaphysical way, it's not pure medicine from a take this pill, or let me cut into this to take this out that's harming you. Just like help someone on a more global sense. It's a lot more gratifying. Like you can really turn someone's life around that way, right? So that's why I'm super excited about this discussion, because I get to talk to someone who truly turns people's lives around. Rabbi Moshe Wiener, welcome to the Iser Health Podcast.
Thank you.
As we get into this, I guess the first obvious question is, you have smicha, you are a Rav, and you also are a social worker, and previously you've been a teacher. But I'm curious from a Judaism standpoint. Judaism is practiced by millions, I guess, around the world. Mm-hmm. Not everyone gravitates towards the rabbinic route, and there's probably a lot of reasons for that. Maybe some of it is people just not feeling like that they have the chops to become a rabbi. They don't feel like they're spiritually close enough to be a rabbi. They're afraid of trying to have that hashpah, that influence on other people. And then there are the other group of people that feel like this is something that I am set up for in life. And I'm curious, what was the first memory you have of thinking, this is how I want to influence lives? Do you know what that first experience in Judaism was?
Right. That's a great question. So actually, it wasn't in the plans for me to become a rabbi, as a pulpit rabbi, running, having a community and a shul, and a sermon. It was actually, for many, many years, I had this hesitation to speak publicly. It was something that was very challenging for me. And I refused to speak publicly. I would always avoid it for many years. And it just, like Hashgacha Pratis, where I moved in, there was a beautiful community that was being built for 55 and older. And once they had the first meeting there, which was Shabbos HaGadol, it's going to be coming up 10 years. So I dive in there, and they asked me to speak, and I said, okay. I did a little preparation just in case they're going to ask. And I spoke, and then that was it. Every Shabbos since then, I've been speaking. It wasn't easy. It was challenging in the beginning. But over time, once you do things over and over again, and you enjoy it, you're passionate about it, you want to share words of Torah with people, to inspire people, to motivate people to do more, to achieve more. So there's a feel-good element eventually that shows up. But it wasn't in the plans initially to become a Rav of a community or a shul.
Do you remember your first association with Judaism where, even if it wasn't in your plans, you just felt like you gravitated towards the religious Welt versus, the religious world, versus some people who it's a part of their lives, but it's not as much of a main focus in their life. Yeah,
Right.
go ahead.
Yeah. So I grew up in Detroit, in Michigan. My parents are religious Chabad family, and I went to yeshiva, Yeshiva Beis Yehuda in Detroit, and then eventually I went to Masifta, Yeshiva Ketana, and Yeshiva Gedola. So my world, as I was growing up, was all about Yiddishkeit, Judaism, learning. There's this idea of a bayis malei svarim, where the house is filled with svarim, and this, when a child grows up with a house filled with svarim, it usually has an impact on them, on their unconscious, that they experience this, they see this. There's this fascinating story that there was a professor who wanted to do an experiment, and so what he did was he was looking to marry somebody who was willing to do this experiment with him, and he finally found somebody, another professor, and they got married, and they said that in their house they're only going to have everything in their house is going to be related to chess, and so they're going to have chess boards, books about chess, posters on the walls about chess masters. Everything's going to be chess. And what they wanted to see is what's going to happen with the children that were going to be born. And I think they ended up having 4 girls. And the girls had nothing to do in the house except for play chess, read about chess, look at chess masters. And that's all they had. And they each grew up to be chess masters. And so that story tells us an unbelievable, the influence of things that we experience and that we see, how that impacts us in the direction that we go. So, you asked what was the first experience that I had. It was really my upbringing as a in a Chabad family, focused on Torah, on mitzvahs, on kiruv, on bringing people closer to Yiddishkeit, and that blossomed, Baruch Hashem, and came to what it is now.
So I love that story because it also reinforces the reality that often in life we try to teach people things, like actively, you should do this. And I guess in some ways that's part of what this is about, is trying to teach people the best way to be healthy in various different fashions. But you can't really teach anyone anything. People can learn something, you can't really teach something. And what that story kind of reinforces is it's all the things around actively teaching someone and sitting down that had the influence on these kids to grow up and actually model the behavior that the parents wanted them to model, but more through passive means, right? Like, oh, well, if you're going to go downstairs, there's a chessboard there. If you go to right? And I'm sure occasionally that can have the opposite effect on people, if you feel like you're inundated or suffocated to some extent. But in general, right, if you can't, don't do as I say, not as I do, right? So if I imagine, right, if like in that story, but the parents never played chess and only play checkers, but you have to play chess, I imagine it would have ended up a little differently. Right. So I like how it reinforces that. Is there any specific behavior, because I imagine someone can grow up very similar to you, but also have a very different outcome. Was there a specific behavior that you noticed in your house besides for, the general, the Weltanschauung, I think is right, the general...
The atmosphere, the avira.
Yeah,
right.
The avira, the right. Atmosphere of the house. Was there specific moments or specific things that maybe parents or siblings did that also reinforced that kind of behavior and that kind of love?
Right, yeah. I think, my father, my mother, their devotion to Yiddishkeit and to Milas Chasadim, to helping people. I remember, I told my father recently, I remember a childhood memory. My father has this very large set of Shulchan Aruch, like very, very tall. Like, I don't think they make them today, but in those days they made like really large. And I remember as a little kid, like thinking, wow, Tati's probably spending like up late at night learning these Svarim. and it was just a memory that I had as a kid, an imagination that I had. And that thought, I was 5 or 6 at the time. And I still have that like vivid memory. And I was also very fortunate and lucky to have great Rabbeim. Rabbi Wiener, all Shalom, he passed away recently. Unbelievable influence on my life in Yeshiva Gedola. But yeah, it was the atmosphere, the values that were instilled in us as children, both from home and in the yeshivas that we went to, had a big impact on who we are today. And it's, science is catching up, with the whole epigenetics, right? We thought in the past it's all about the genes, and really epigenetics plays a big part in turning on or turning off genes, which impact the person and the journey that they end up following and going. Right, the study of the triplets. So this is not ethical, so they don't do this anymore. But there's a famous study of triplets where they identical, so everything's like the DNA, everything's the same, 3 triplets, and they put them into 3 different families. And one was a higher socioeconomic, like a wealthier family, middle class family, and impoverished family, and they grew up, and there was major differences in how they operated, in their behaviors, in the way they thought, once they became adults. And the reason why we don't do this anymore is because I think one of the triplets committed suicide after we found out that they were a study.
Wow.
But the idea that the environment, the aver, the seviva, has a great impact on the individual, especially as in the child. Because think about a child's life. A child is growing up and is exploring and learning, and the beginning, and everything's about the beginning, how the beginning starts. That's how things grow. You know, that's Adam Eitz Asada, a person's like a tree. And one of the things about a tree is when you plant it, if it's tilting one way or the other way, or how you plant it, and all the different details of it, impacts the growth of the tree, the quality of the tree, and the pay rates that the tree is going to produce eventually. And so, yeah, the atmosphere is vitally important, and to create the best atmosphere that one could for their children.
That's a terrible study, but
that's why they don't do that anymore.
Yeah, I sometimes, I guess you look back at some forms of medicine and things that people did to try and understand human behavior and science a little bit better, and you wonder how at the time did anyone even think, that separating family as a study would be something that would be remotely acceptable. And thank God they've instituted policies of ethics these days to help prevent stuff like that from happening again. At the same time, unfortunately, you do learn a lot from these situations. I guess one of the things that you probably use all the time in your work is the idea that you can have also some control of your environment and have agency, and that you're not fully a product of, like you said, your genetics and things that are inside of you, that you have the ability to dictate your behavior and how you want to see your life change. So that's probably a pretty important lesson for people who don't have that level of agency in their life.
Right. And when we do know that, even if somebody has a certain environment that they grew up in, that doesn't mean that they're destined to be like this forever. Actually, we're able to reverse, right? We know this with medicine as well. If somebody is a smoker, a heavy smoker, and then they quit smoking, which is a very challenging thing to do, to quit smoking. Once they do that, their lungs could be impacted tremendously. But over the course of 10 years, if they don't smoke, the lungs return to as if they never smoked, which means the body's able to heal itself. The brain's able to heal if you do the work. So we're able to reverse what happened through different activities, behaviors, and changes, to be able to say, okay, even though I had these experiences that maybe weren't optimal or what I wanted as a child, because a child can't really control how their environment is, but we as adults have the agency to change that and to have control over our destiny.
This is like Elul Torah right here, right?
There you
That's the charata and doing teshuva. Right. So right, if you can change your behavior, you can really wipe the slate clean, so to speak. Which is poignant. I think another example is caffeine addiction. A lot of people have it because it's how we get through our day, and have very productive days and very long days sometimes. But there's side effects. There's caffeine withdrawals, right? There's certainly caffeine toxicity. I actually recently saw a case in the emergency department of a patient who ingested too much caffeine, and that is a real thing too. So people have to be careful. Usually that's not in like physiologic quantities. If you drink a bunch of cups of coffee, it's not going to happen. But they do have concentrated powders that there is something to be aware of there. But on the flip side, people have terrible caffeine withdrawals, which I unfortunately am a sufferer myself. But I believe there's evidence to support that really, if you're able to wean yourself off and down 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 days, you can actually return to a level of capability that you wouldn't have thought possible based off of your experience with caffeine withdrawals and how you need it on a daily basis. So there are ways to fix almost every behavior in our life. It comes with challenges. It's not simple. It's not easy. And sometimes you need to have a game plan, right? You can't just be like, I have 7 cups of coffee a day. Tomorrow I'm having 0. I imagine that's dangerous, and also you're not going to feel very good, and it's probably not the best way to do it, right? I think extreme methods of changing behavior generally don't work. You brought up the smoking example. The cold turkey without nicotine for most people, and I haven't looked at any studies for this, but I imagine it just does not work, right? You have to be able...
is high.
Right. You have to be able to replace and be sensitive to how you are managing the symptoms in order to successfully change your life. And I imagine, once again, in your field, it's no different, right? Like there are plenty of habits or mind frame, different shifts of how someone thinks, right? In order to achieve that shift, you need to have a plan, right? Like this is where you are now. You're 9 steps away from where you want to be, right? But you can't jump from step 1 to step 9, right? So how do we get you along the pathway of all the steps?
That's what the Gemara says: "Tafasa merubah tafasta." Right? If you try to do too much at once, you end up with nothing. And you mentioned caffeine. Like there's a lot of unintended consequences of drinking too much caffeine that people don't usually think about. There's the withdrawal when you want to cut down, but there's also the sleep impact. So when someone drinks a lot of caffeine, there's a half-life. I'm not exactly sure. It's between 4 to 8 hours of a half-life where half of the caffeine is still in your body circulating, interrupting the sleep process. And even people say like, well, I've fallen asleep after drinking a cup of coffee, but you don't get the REM sleep, the rapid eye movement sleep, and then NREM sleep, which is what the body needs in order to be able to function the coming day. And so it disturbs the sleep. It's also, it makes it, if someone has anxiety, is suffering from anxiety, having caffeine exacerbates that feeling, that experience. And so someone could be drinking 3, 4, 5 cups of coffee a day, and they're trying to calm themselves, but really what they're doing is they're making themselves more anxious as they go along. And so, it's really important to everything in different port, not overdoing something. And so when you want to have coffee, to drink coffee, 1 or 2 cups in the morning, but try to avoid having later cups, later in the afternoon. And it could be if you want to stop and cut drinking coffee, there's a process to that the withdrawal shouldn't be as severe. So it's drinking more water than you usually drink, cut down slowly. So you have, instead of, if you fill it up with, let's say 2 teaspoons, have 1 teaspoon per cup, and then, cut down on 1 cup a day, and then the next week another cup a day until you get to 1 cup a day, and then slowly mitigate until you're caffeine free. And it's actually, the feeling is unbelievable. And when you're caffeine free, and you're only drinking water, most people feel more energy than with a coffee. Because with the coffee, the caffeine that we're drinking, we're trying to boost ourselves, but our body becomes habituated to it. And therefore, we don't feel that strong boost anymore. We're trying to relive the boost that we felt so long ago when we had the first cup of coffee that our brains remember. And so when you get off of caffeine, I did this for 2 years once. I mean, I drink a coffee every morning. But for 2 years, I was caffeine free, and it was amazing. But what was even more amazing was the first cup afterwards.
I've heard a similar story to that, and I have heard that like you said, you're chasing the high, so to speak, of what happened when you first had coffee. And I think my maximum amount of time off of coffee after being a coffee drinker was 9 days. It was a Pesach a few years ago. And we just, and get all the stuff together so I could have all the stuff kosher for Pesach, so I could have coffee the right way. And it wasn't available for me in the hospital. So I think I got to get to day 3 or 4, and I said, I think we could do this, right? And I think I got to day 9, and I was back in the emergency department, and it was like a 7 a.m. shift. And I was looking around, and I'm just like, I should have a cup of coffee for the patients, right? Like at some point, I just felt like I'm going to be a better doctor if I have this cup in my hand. And I was interested in continuing the experiment, so to speak, but that's where it ended. I do imagine a time where I'm going to go back. I don't know that I'm going to get to 2 years, but at least to wean myself down, wean myself off, especially before a fast day, it's probably exceptionally important. The other thing you said there about the everything in moderation, so we have the prayer of the Rambam of Maimonides up there, and the shvil. I always think about the shvil zav that for most traits, almost all of them, I believe, Kas. Someone can tell me if I'm wrong because I'm not the biggest lamdan here. I don't know everything.
Kas and Gaiva are the extreme.
Thank you.
Not to have any part, not to go there.
Exactly. Perfect. I have you to fact check me mid. That's exactly what I need, because otherwise it's going to come back in a comment later. So yes, exactly. But most things are in moderation in life. And if you can figure out where that is for yourself personally, then in general, you are going to optimize, I guess, your lifestyle and be as productive as possible without falling into the traps of being, once again, what happens when you get too extreme. You give all your money away, become too miserly. Both of those are bad midas to have, bad character traits. So there's definitely, it's why I have it on the wall. I think it's the perfect example. why does it even have to be said not to do it, right? And I think the answer is natural inclination. People buy into extremes. If you look all over social media right now, right? Like I need to do something right now that's clickbait. I have to be like, you'll hear something here you've never heard elsewhere, and people need to click on the video because of that, right? Because people buy into extreme presentations, extreme modalities, because there must be something very intrinsically exciting about it, right? But the reality is that, and this is where it comes back to medicine, right? When you fall in love with an extreme form of medicine, really, alternative, right? Which there's obviously, it's laced with complications, right? There's the potential for a snake oil salesman, right? There's certainly a lot of uncertainty in medicine. There's a lot that we can do better. There's no question about that. But I've heard other people say this. It's very, sorry that I'm going on a tangent here. But
Bird walking.
when someone comes in with abdominal pain, right, and I see them, and I've said this before, a pediatric patient with abdominal pain, let's say they're nauseous, maybe a low-grade fever. It's right in the generalized belly button area, but it's not extreme. They're well-appearing. Their vitals are good. I have a conversation about early appendicitis usually, because that would be one of my bigger concerns that the patient could later have that I didn't catch at this visit. But when I have that conversation, it's a lot of hemming and hawing. It's, you have to look out for this. You have to consider this. If this happens, come back here. I don't say, it's a virus, it's fine, go home, everything will be okay. Why? Because even if it's generally true, the time that I'm wrong, I'm very wrong, and there's serious ramifications. At the same time, I imagine for the patient and the patient's parents, it's not rewarding to hear a doctor talk about how it could be this and it could be that, and you should, right? Because it's not as definitive as people want to see. Which is why, and I appreciate that. I know it's not as rewarding. But at the same time, when you go to someone else who says things with absolute conviction, certainty, and it's very extreme, that is a concerning opinion. But as we said before, people gravitate towards it because it probably has some degree of reassurance,
I think what people are looking for is for immediate help. They just want to be good, feel good. They want to function optimally. They want everything just to be working. And so when someone is suffering, whether it's physically, emotionally, psychologically, they want a quick fix. They don't want to continue to suffer, and they don't want to do the long route, because why should I have to do something hard for 3 months, 6 months when I could just pop a few vitamins, or I could go take this potion or this. And the reality is that lefum tsara agra, right? The reality is that, if you want real serious change, it's going to take work. And it's going to take effort, and it's going to take, some pain that they're going to experience. As long as it's within the right direction, and you're doing, the right behaviors that we know are beneficial for that, what the person is trying to accomplish. And so, the Rambam speaks about, in the same Rambam that you mentioned, about kas and gaiva being, staying far away from those midos. But when somebody finds themselves having a certain midah that they don't want, the Rambam speaks about going to the other extreme. So it's not about going and asking someone telling you what you should take or you should do, but it's yourself saying, 1 second, I'm struggling with this, so let me go to the other extreme until I'm able to get to the mamutza, the middle part, which is beneficial for the person and for everyone around them.
This is like my favorites over here, all of the lines that we've said, Lapum Sara Agra, the Shil Zav, like these are the things that I get passionate about, especially in with regards to medicine, right? Because I think that, like you said, people just want to be cured, right? And it's like being a mechanic for the body. People go to the mechanic says $1,900, your rotor's going, your thingamajiggy, there's a whole bunch of names that I'm not familiar with, and we have to take them at face value that what they're saying is accurate, and that they're being authentic. And the same thing happens when you go to a doctor, and it's very easy for someone to get swindled, for lack of a better word, right? To have the wool pulled over their eyes as far as what the treatment is. But if you could look for, how do I tell you to recognize someone who's going to handle, someone who's going to try and get something on top, over you? And the answer is like that level of certainty. Like if you're talking to anyone in the medical field, I guess beyond a mumcha, like a super expert at what they're doing and what their advice is, but they're just giving all these, I guess if someone told you with certainty that being obese and overweight and hypertension is going to be bad for your overall health, you should probably listen to them. That's pretty common sense to me. But other modalities of treatment where there's probably multiple options, but they're presenting like one option as the only option, one diet as the only diet, like those are times to be a little bit curious, skeptical, exactly, correctly.
Do some research.
do some research. Unfortunately, these days, and once again, another reason for this this podcast, for this talk, is I think research has, yes, there's authentic, true research, right? You go through the papers, randomized, double-blinded controlled studies, meta-analyses, like this is, but it's also, it's not exciting. It could be very word-heavy and very difficult to interpret. And sometimes there's different interpretations, right? So I think most people have to go to some other form of research, which is a lower caliber research and a little bit more susceptible to having different pieces of inauthentic falsehoods in them, right? So it's very tough, especially, I've said this before, if you go on ChatGPT, right, you go into any AI and you say 10 reasons for this, right, and then give me 10 reasons against this, whatever you put in as your prompt is essentially what it's going to spit back to you for the most part. So I think this is an opportunity for people to connect with a provider that they just feel like that's the mahalach. That's how I feel in my life. I have a certain level of trust with how they're acting as a professional, and I will trust their word, right? Because in many forms of life, we have to trust things all the time, right? When I get onto an airplane, I am trusting the pilot. When I would get into a taxi or an Uber or Lyft or something like that, you got to trust the person who's driving the car. So it's important that you kind of offload some of that. If you don't trust anybody, you don't trust anything, then it's going to be very hard to get by in life, right? You got to trust that the food that you're buying is not spoiled or wasn't contaminated. And nothing's perfect, unfortunately, but you certainly have to learn to trust something or someone. And I think the best way to do it is to see how they behave and be like, that's the person that I model myself after, or that's the person that I would like to, if I have a certain issue, that's the person who I'd like to go to potentially help solve that issue, or at least ameliorate it. Yeah.
There's a famous Talmudic saying, right? In the Gemara is "Toiv shebarei from legehenim." The best of the doctors go to hell. Yeah. And I have my there's many different explanations about that, what that actually means. We can look at the study of the triplets and say, well, Toiv shebarei from legehenim, they put 3 people through hell, right? Or they do experiments on people that they shouldn't be doing. But one of the explanations are Toiv shebarayfim, a doctor who's really good, he knows what's best for the patient, and he knows what the patient should be doing or could be doing, identifying what will be beneficial, behavioral changes, habit changes, small changes, micro changes that will be beneficial over the long term. And sometimes it's really painful to watch the patient refuse and go to the extreme instead, knowing that it's not gonna work. But sitting there with the patient and say, okay, you have agency over yourself. At the end of the day, the patient makes the decisions for themselves, what they're going to want to do, and figuring out for themselves if it works, if it doesn't work. But it's, looking at the research, figuring out there's things that are known to be beneficial, both physically, emotionally, psychologically for the person, and focusing on that and trying to, taking baby steps. As you said earlier, that we want quick fixes and we want things to happen right away, but recognizing that doesn't happen like that. For example, speaking about obesity, if somebody struggles with obesity, it didn't happen overnight, and therefore losing the weight is not going to happen overnight. It's a process. It's going to take time, and people want quick fixes and they want things to just change right away. It just doesn't work like that.
You've literally chosen all of the greatest hits of the Gemara phrases that I enjoy, and more than enjoy, I take them to heart. That shot, I think Rashi, and once again, in the comments below if I'm wrong, but I think Rashi mentions, and I've looked it up recently, that because you're not gonna treat the poor, and because you're gonna look to capitalize on that kind of knowledge. So there's definitely, it's fraught, right? Being a physician is fraught, and I love that phrase because it really can be interpreted in so many different ways. I think one straight shot, one straight interpretation is really that there's a lot of gaiva, a lot of arrogance that can go into being a doctor, and having a long white coat, and when someone calls you Mr. instead of doctor, it's like doctor, right? Yeah. And there could be a lot of gaiva and a lot of arrogance that comes with that, and that is the highway to go in the wrong direction in life, right? 100%. My other favorite interpretation, and I wish I remember who told me this, so I'm quoting in the name of someone. I did not come up with this, and it's similar to what you said. Is you're talking about patient autonomy, that patients can make their own decisions in life, and we can only hope to guide them the best that we can. This is also from the angle of just witnessing suffering, right? Mm-hmm. That the best of doctors, if you're a real doctor, if you really care about the patient in front of you, then you inherit suffering in this world, right? True suffering. And I think about the doctors that work in extreme situations. I think about a patient that I saw not too long ago who came in with a very benign complaint. Lovely, lovely elderly people. You couldn't ask for better people or patients and better conversations, because I do enjoy my conversations. And I was like, I'm a little bit nervous that something might be going on in the belly. They haven't had a CAT scan in a while. They're a little bit older, and colonoscopies they haven't had in a while, which, the screening said not to necessarily do them at that point. Weren't really having symptoms before then. And the CAT scan came back and is probably indicative of a neoplasm of unfortunately likely cancer. And, hopefully they have a good prognosis, and sitting down with the patient and, the sweetest individual, and having to have that conversation. I mean, I'm still thinking about it. It's still on the top of my head. I drove in thinking about it. I'll probably drive home thinking about it. I'm sure I'm going to make sure to recheck in, or maybe even give a call in the next couple of weeks, just to see. I can't do anything anymore, but just to see how they're doing. That is what inheriting Gehenna looks like a little bit. But that's the job. That's the tafkid, right?
So that's the doctor suffering.
Right.
With the situation of the patient. Then there's a toiv shebrayfim. They go into the Gehenna of the patient, which means they go into the risky situations to save and to help a patient. And I heard from Rabbi Spurg, who's a member of the community of Cambridge Heights, where he says toiv shebrayfim is that toiv is the gematria 17. When we forget about Rafa'inu, we forget about our spiritual connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we forget about davening to Hashem, and that Hashem is the one who heals the sick, and we think that's all of us. That's the Gehenna.
I think I heard it from you. That's who I heard it from. Yeah, no, that's part of, that's, you said it perfectly. And I love that the single phrase has two different meanings that are both 1,000% true. And it really is perspective to how you identify with that phrase. And I also love how at face value, it seems like a mind-blowing phrase. What are you talking about? It makes no sense. And in so many ways, it makes so much sense. So it's, just another, just the added wisdom that you can get from a simple passage in Gemara and Talmud is really incredible. We're never going to get through this episode, because we're going to talk, and we're just going to have a schmooze. That's what this is. It's a schmooze. Forget the podcast at this point. But we're going to have part 2, clearly, and part 3 eventually. But we will work our way to where we want to get to at some point. Going back, you decided to go into teaching initially, right? Maybe the hardest field. I mean, I'm sure an oil rigger or something like that is taxing.
Air traffic control. Is second is the hardest, and teaching is second.
Correct.
Right? Because air traffic control, one mistake, God forbid, there's an accident, and teaching, you have 25, 30 kids in a classroom, and everything you do is going to be impactful for the child for future generations, not just for the child, but for their kids, intergenerational trauma and all that. And so. Yeah, it wasn't like I never thought about what I was going to do when I was a kid. I mean, some kids think about what they're going to do. For me, it wasn't. I never thought about it. It just wasn't like that. At least in my conscious mind, I don't recall. But when I was in Koilel after I got married, a friend of mine started a organization called Menachem Education Foundation, and he asked me if I'd like to join to get trained to be a teacher. I'm like, oh yeah, let me try that. Let me see how that goes. And I went and heard some very interesting, courses and workshops and classes, and then I decided, let me look into it. My mother happened to be she taught in public school downtown Detroit for many years. My grandmother's a teacher, so I had teaching in the blood. And then I started teaching. I taught for 11 years, and I was a principal for 2 years when the school needed to be a principal. So it was great. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's fascinating. It's enjoyable. There's a lot of sipuk, a lot of like satisfaction that someone gets when they teach. And the kids, like, you see them thrive and grow and ask questions and want to know more. They're just sponges. Kids want more and more and more, and they have like the big question of why, and that's like if you go there with them, that they just eat it all up, and so it's great. So yes, I did that for 13 years, and then after I finished, when I was a principal for 2 years, and I went back to teaching. So during the 2 years of teaching after being a principal, I went to school to get my master's in social work.
My wife's grandfather, he was a Rebbe years and years and years ago. I believe in MTA. When I'm wrong about the story, he'll correct me. But I'll do the best that I can. And so he taught for a period of time. And afterwards, he ended up going into business with actually his father-in-law, and it was like the watch business. And this is decades and decades ago. And it was back at a time where there weren't a lot of yarmulkes at these stores, right? And there was, for a brief period of time, he had to ask himself what he was going to do, right? This is a Rebbe in a yeshiva, right? And he came to the conclusion, the decision, I have to. There's no option. And that's something that resonates with me. I've worked in many places, including a couple months in medical school and in a prison. And, you know, the yarmulkes never come off. And I have my own philosophy on that. But what happened was one day, one of his former Talmudim came into the store. And he thought to himself, and he thinks to himself to this day, to the extent that I've heard the story, what if, God forbid, I wasn't wearing a yarmulke? Like, what kind of influence would that have had on his student, his Talmud, that walked through the door and saw his Rebbe from yeshiva, right, without a yarmulke on his head, God forbid? And, you know, it obviously shows the character that he has, but just the influence that a Rebbe or a teacher has on their student inadvertently. And it goes back to what we said before, that you can't really teach things. People can observe things and learn things, right? So you could have said everything you wanted to say, all the information, all the Gemara, all the Mishnah in school, but if 2, 3, 5, 6 years later, the person who looked up to you sees you in that different fashion, everything can crumble in an instant for them. So, you know, being a Rebbe, a teacher, is a massive responsibility, as you obviously were aware.
You know, now that the school year started, in many schools, they started it. I told a Rebbe, who was a friend of mine, I said, a veteran teacher told me before I began teaching that the four most important words that you need to know and live by as a teacher are never take anything personal. All right? So that kids are going to be kids, and they come with a lot of systems. They come with a lot of influences, what's like at home, their siblings, what they ate if they ate, right? If they had what they got, what they wanted, if they got into a fight with a sibling, if a parent did something, and then the bus ride. And there's so much that goes into before the child actually comes to school. And then the child comes to school, and something's going on, right? And realizing that it's not against the teacher. And so realizing that never taking anything personal is essential to be able to then deliver on making the atmosphere of the classroom a warm, loving atmosphere. If you think about it, I told the same teacher, a friend of mine, I said, he taught my son last year, I said to him, in 20 years from now, your students, if you ask them what they remember from your class, what do you think they're going to say? I said, I guarantee you they're not going to say the psukim that you taught them or the Rashi. They may say some of the things that you did with them, like he cooked tongue when he taught about the pasuk with Avram Avinu. You know, he did some demonstrations of different parts, but they're going to remember how they felt in the classroom, the feeling. And where does that feeling come from? That feeling comes from the atmosphere, the avir, and the love, the libshaft that a teacher gives to the student. Not taking anything personal allows you to do that. When a teacher takes something personal, then they're butting heads with a child, and what the child is going to remember about that year, a negative feeling, not a positive feeling. And what's that going to do for what we're trying to teach the children? To live a life of Yiddishkeit with values, of Jewish values, of learning Torah mitzvahs. They're going to have a negative feeling, and that's going to get in the way of growth for that child when they get older. And so the most important thing is create that atmosphere for the child.
Right. Very few people are going to remember what you said, but they'll remember how you made them feel.
Exactly.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
It seems like we prepped this beforehand, but I promise we didn't. No, because these are all, you know, these are words that I live by too. You know, when I go into a patient's room, I think of that same thing. You know, depending on the scenario, they're not necessarily going to remember too much about the encounter, but they'll remember did they feel good seeing the doctor, or did they feel like they were maltreated, mistreated? Mm-hmm. You know, so for example, when I work both here and elsewhere, it's important for me to take a seat when I can take a seat, to look at someone in the face and not look at the computer when that's also possible, and to set the situation up so that it should be possible, to ask questions that are not part of your strict history of present illness, your HPI questions, right. To really get to know someone, because A, there are things that are truly insightful there that are going to help the current patient at that present moment, but B, the humanistic component of medicine. That's the art of medicine. And not only is it the art of medicine, I really postulate that in the next 10, 15 years, it is going to be the medicine that we're generally able to provide for patients, beyond perhaps the procedures that are still going to require the technical prowess of the doctor. And I think patients are going to want a doctor or a surgeon standing behind the procedure ultimately for just security purposes. I think a lot of medicine might be liberated into a lot of the technology and AI that is out there, which is going to be for the betterment of patients, as long as it's accurate and it knows when to redirect. But doctors leaning into the humanistic element of medicine, the art of medicine. I've said this story before. I went to a doctor only once, never went more than that. Won't refuse. No, I'm kidding. But I do remember I went to a doctor and I was healthy. It was a well visit or something like that. I was a doctor or a medical school. I don't know. And they put a stethoscope on my back and I knew my lungs were clear. They put their hand on my shoulder, a stethoscope on my back, and I felt better. I can't explain that. There's something to it. And that's what I try and model in a room, right? That sometimes there are things that maybe is not so necessary from a physical exam standpoint always, but it's something that the patient's expecting. And there's also this comforting component to it having been done. And that's the art of medicine that I think we all have to lean into for the probably for the foreseeable future as things are changing.
Right. If you think about it, right? So we have this either dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, right? The endorphins, the chemicals that make us feel good. And a lot of that has to do with the social interaction with another person and the touch, the feel, the presence. And they say, I don't remember the exact number, but therapy. So the success of a therapist with a client, with a patient, 70% of it is rapport with that therapist, the feeling that they have with that therapist. Not so much what is said or the modalities that are used, but the feeling, the experience that they have in that room with that therapist. And that goes a long way. 70 to 80% of the success is based on that.
Wow. What is one thing you miss about teaching? It might be nothing.
No. So there's, when you're teaching, when I was teaching, I made once a list of like a lot of words that are essential that start with the letter P. And one of them is performing. When you're teaching, you're in order to engage the children, like if we're just going to read the Chumash and repeat it and have them repeat it, read the Mishnayos or read the Gemara and have them repeat it and just talk, so we're going to lose their attention very quickly. And so it's really important to perform, to have a presence. And so that's something that, on Shabbos when I speak, there's some, it's limited, but something like that, there's a element of that. But when in the classroom, you can have a lot of fun with that. And that's the one thing that I missed. But teaching is kudos to all the teachers because it is the most challenging profession out there. Everything you do and say is being recorded by 25, 30 minds, and they're watching and they're picking it up and they're noticing and they're interpreting it and they're using it either for their benefit or against you. And so recognizing that that's just the reality. And now your job is to teach the children that they should come on knowing the chomer, knowing how to read, knowing the translation, knowing to be able to learn on their own. And now merging those two together is a real challenge. Like how do you keep the kids engaged and milsa b'duchusa, say a joke, a story, and at the same time, hit the goals that the anhala and the parents expect of you. There's if you ask, I think there's a study with the parents, American parents, if they ask the parents, what do you want from your child when it comes to school? And the parents say, all I want is my child to be happy, right? So what they want is a child to be happy. Yet at the same time, they also want the child to be successful academically and know the learning, understand it, and have broad knowledge, be able to apply it, be able to daven, and all these, know where to look up. So a teacher has this very difficult job to do, is to engage the children, make them feel the atmosphere, to make them feel loved and understood, and at the same time hold court, because if you allow a kid to act up, that's going to be problematic because it has a ripple effect, and not to be punitive because that's going to hurt the child. At the same time, to be firm, to allow that you could be able to teach the children and engage them so they should both learn, feel good, and then you have children who come in who have struggles, and it's easy for a teacher to just try to use punitive measures and try to squash that child. But then what are we doing to that child? What are we teaching that child? How's the child feeling when we do that? And it's really difficult to find a healthy balance to be able to go ahead and like walk over to the child and have a siman or a sign, or find a way to communicate to the child to mitigate the behavior, and at the same time simultaneously teaching and educating the 30 other children. So it's a really tough job, underappreciated. But I'm very thankful that I had that opportunity 13 years. of teaching. And I still consider myself a teacher because in therapy we do psychoeducation. It's very different, but there's still an element of teaching that exists in therapy.
That sort of reminds me that when I was in high school, I had a Rebbe for 2-3 years. He's shout out to Rabbi Wiener, right? No relation?
No relation.
No relation. And he used to, he was a Gemara Rebbe, taught other subjects as well, but that's what I remember him from. And I had him for an extended period of time for high school education, and he lived in the community. And I distinctly remember in class, he would get up with his feet on the base of the chalkboard and his hands on the desk, and mid Gemara would just start like throwing down like 20 push-ups as he was, and it was always like grabbing your attention. And he's actually, if I remember correctly, a physical therapist as well. So I mean, movement for him and the importance of, keeping the body maintained, and exercise is obviously something that he finds and found very valuable. And he was able to integrate that with his shir, with his teaching. And probably, as I reflect on it, it's 2 lessons in one, right? That you got to take care of yourself. You got to keep it, or maybe 3. Take care of yourself, keep things interesting, and we also have to get the job done at the same time.
Yeah, that's really essential. Like being, self-care, being able to take care of yourself so you could function optimally in whatever capacity that you're in. I speak a lot about this in therapy to individuals. I think it's so important. It's like the yesod, the foundation is self-care, and in 4 specific areas where they're most prevalent and most impactful. And that is, sleep, to be able to sleep and get good sleep between 7 to 9 hours, which is very challenging, especially in the summer months when Ma'ariv is late. But 7 to 9 hours of solid sleep is important. Our brain needs it, and it's really hard to function when we have less than that. Drinking enough water. So a lot of times we forget to drink water, and the body needs to have some water.
Said the brachas already.
Yeah. So the body needs about 70 ounces of water a day, depending on the size of the person, 70 to 100 ounces of water a day. And that's just, if we don't do that, we feel dehydrated and we're not going to function optimally. And then there's exercise, like you were mentioning about your Rebbe, doing exercise. It's so important. 30 minutes of exercise a day. There's so many studies that show that mitigates, doesn't get rid of anxiety or depression or any, struggles, psychological, emotional struggles, but it mitigates it, it lowers it. And so if you do exercise every single morning for 30 minutes, you're going to see a difference, not right away, but over the course of time, you're going to see a major difference. And so there's that element. And then there's I would say, they're all equally important, but so important is because we're putting fuel in our body. And what are we fueling our body with? And I am so passionate about fueling our body with healthy food.
You put the signs around the health center.
I did, yes, healthy habits. It's so hard because in front of us is colorful, tasty food that screams at you, eat me and eat me more and consume me. And it's more of a modern thing. And a lot of that impacts our, mitochondria, our cells, and our feelings, and it impacts our brain as well, because we're putting this fuel in, which doesn't have nutrition, and it has negative stuff as well. So I'm big about avoiding processed foods as much as you can, avoiding sugars. It inflames the body. Want to eat, the body needs real food meaning protein, chicken, fish, without dosing it with sugar, like just real food, fats, nuts, avocados, and the like. And then fiber. Fiber is essential. Having the vegetables that talk to you, that you will enjoy eating, and then fruit, and avoiding all the processed foods, because what it does to you, it makes you feel miserable. Ask almost anybody who eats a lot of bread, a lot of cookies and cake. It's in abundance, and because it's so cheap and it's easy to make. But if you eat and you fuel yourself in that, your body's not going to feel good. And if your body doesn't feel good, it's going to be hard to make changes. Whether those are changes in your behavior, in your feelings, in your thoughts, whatever those changes are. And so those are the 4 pillars of a foundation that I talk about a lot, and I think it's so important. And sometimes, again, tefasta merubah like tefasta. Sometimes you need smart goals, right? SMART goals are taking any goal you have and creating a SMART goal, so you're very specific. So if someone says, I'm going to start eating healthy, the likelihood of them starting to eat healthy is very small unless they make it very specific. For example, before I have anything that's processed, I'm first going to have a salad, or I'm first going to have a cucumber, or I'm first going to eat fish. So at least you're giving your body some good fuel before you throw in something that's not so great for your body. And so you're being very specific of what you're going to make changes on. It's measurable. You can measure, did you do it or not? It's attainable, it's reasonable, it makes sense, and there's a timeline that you place on it. Ideally, the timeline for eating healthy should be forever. It's not like diets. They say 95% of people who diet fail, which means they regain their weight or more afterwards within a year. And the reason is because people look at it as, I'm going to lose the weight and then I'm done, and then they go back to their old habits. And really, what's important is that we make a decision that this is what's good for my body, and then forever this is what I'm going to be doing. Now, yeah, there may be exceptions by a simcha. Maybe on a Yom Tov, you have a little piece of cheesecake on Shavuos, but overall, 360 days a year, you're going to be eating healthy, and that's choik v'lo yavar. You're going to feel a lot better.
The Chulin and Kugel corporations are going to come after us after this podcast is released. I don't know that they qualify as the whole foods, but obviously delicious and everything in some moderation, right? So you reserve that for the right time. Yeah. Maybe not Leil Shishi. I'm not getting into that controversy. That's
but Chulin could be really good for you if you have barley and you have meat. Potatoes are not the best for you, right? They're not the best. Starch is not the best for you. If you don't put Some people put oil. You shouldn't put oil in your chulin, right? If you're going to put olive oil. So, supplementing with healthier choices, chulin could be great. Actually, a very good source of healthy fuel for the body to help the body feel good and function optimally.
You hear that, chulin companies? We're up for promotion, okay? At the same time, because you were talking about self-care, the example that I love is that you have a cup and a saucer, right? And you can certainly pour from a full cup into other people's cups. And even occasionally, if your cup's not full, you can maybe give a third when you're halfway down. It's very hard to pour into someone else's cup when your cup is empty. And it's very, very hard to just pour from, when your saucer just has, you have nothing left at that point in time. The parable is obviously that you can give of yourself way more when your cup is full. You can occasionally dip into the bank account, so to speak, and pull out some credit so you can help other people when maybe you're not rested, you're not eating as well as you should. But it's very hard to give to anyone when your cup is nearly empty and you're working off of the saucer at that point. So,
yeah, that's great. I look at it flip it the opposite. Not in the same idea, a self-care, but the idea is that we're like a tube and we have a lot of tension, pressure. Mm-hmm. And those pressures are from life, from basic life, marriage, children, responsibilities, bills, community. There's so many pressures that a person has, work-related pressures. And so if we don't do self-care, something's gonna give. And so what's important is to have an exit valve to allow the pressure to be released through different activities, whether that activity is exercise, whether it's listening to music, whether it's journaling, whether it's calling a friend and speaking to a friend. It could be playing an instrument. If someone knows how to play an instrument, that could be a way of release valve, like letting the pressure. And that's very helpful. That allows a person to have a full cup and to be able to give to others and to be able to be present in whatever they want to be present with, and not being held back by the stressors of their life.
I'm integrating that example right now. I'm using it in the future. I like the escape valve comparison. Was there a moment as a teacher that maybe you had a one-on-one with a student and that almost shifted how you thought and were like, I would love to have more one-on-ones, because obviously one of the biggest shifts in your life has been one against 30, not against, but so to speak, right? Versus a little bit more of an intimate setting where maybe you can have more of a, you don't have that same hashpah, that same influence on multiple people, but in some ways maybe you have a greater influence on a single person at a specific time. Yeah,
great question. So there's a few examples that come to mind. One particular one was with a student and one was with a parent. As a teacher and as a principal, you get to see that a lot of the influences on the child are the parents, and a lot of challenges parents have that it's difficult for them to create that, as you spoke earlier, that atmosphere, the aver, the environment for the child optimal for them to succeed. And so I once had a meeting with a parent, a husband and wife, mother and father, about a child, and I realized that, wow, it's not so much about the child that we need to work about and talk about to how to help that child succeed in class. It's really about the parents and helping them this exit. They have a lot on their plate. They have things are overwhelming for them, and how to help them function better. And by doing that, like automatically, it'll be helpful for the child. So that was one particular meeting that I had as a principal. And as a teacher, every class that you have a few children that throw you some challenges. And actually what's fascinating is that those children who challenge you, when they come, like afterwards, you remember them the most, and you feel the greatest sipuk, the greatest satisfaction from those children. And when they come back, like that's the greatest nachas ruach a teacher can have, is when a student comes back to see you and says, "Rabbi Wiener, you were," and it's like it's just amazing. It's just so heartfelt, so overwhelming with good emotions. But there's one particular student who had a lot of challenges in first grade, second grade, third grade. I was a Kita Dal Rebbe when I was teaching fourth grade Rebbe. And this student had a lot of challenges, and previously he would be sent out of class here and there, and we had a chat and we had a talk, and we got to an understanding very, very early on, and that's really key when there's a child who's struggling in the classroom, is for the child and the teacher to have a really solid understanding and an agreement. And when that happened, this school year went amazing, and it was just smooth sailing. Oh, there were hiccups here and there, and we had to like reset the understanding maybe a few times throughout the year. But it was just unbelievable. Once we got that to understanding, like I understood him 100%. He was diagnosed with with ADHD, and he had struggles focusing, and we made an agreement and understanding of how things are going to operate. And once that happened, it was smooth sailing. So, coming back to your question, there were a few moments where I felt that wow, one-on-one can be very impactful. Helping people change their lives changes other people's lives as well. Helping a father changing his life and making it easier for him to cope and to deal with stressors. He's able to be more present with his children and sit down and learn, the Gemara or the Mishnayos and not be triggered. So that's something that I experienced and moved on from teaching to therapy.
Speaking of, I guess the rabbinic component to what you do. So there's different components to being, I guess, a Rav, right? And I'm wondering which one you gravitate the most towards. There is the pure drasha, right? You get up there and, like you said, a little bit of a performance. You have to get people engaged. You want them to walk away with a message. There's a little bit more of a chabura, so you have the sermon. Now you have more of an intimate, almost like teaching in a classroom, essentially, right? You have your group with you and you learn something together. And then there's a specific counseling component on more of a one-to-one basis, which is probably, I guess, overlaps more with what you do professionally at the same time. Is there any specific component to it that you gravitate towards more?
Right. So the beautiful community of Cambridge Heights is a 55 and older. It's a development with 55 units of townhouses, essentially. So my main, as Rav there, is mainly speaking on Shabbos, giving a sermon on Shabbos every Shabbos. Also, Shabbos Shuvah Drasha, Shabbos Agadol Drasha. Sometimes, speaking by Yishal Shudas. Sometimes there's questions that come my way, and sometimes there's certain discussions that I need to have with certain people based on their different circumstances. And I'm more than happy. It's my pleasure to be able to help out, to help the community, to facilitate greater growth and harmony in the community. But mainly it's a sermon. It's Shabbos. I give a drasha. I speak to people individually as well, and but it's mainly sermon that I give every Shabbos.
When it comes to social work, because we're about an hour into this thing, and I don't think we've mentioned.
Doesn't even feel like it.
I know. That's why I said a good episode. That's exactly what it's going to feel like. The time flies when you're having fun is the expression, right? Yeah. But the truth is that we're having a lot of fun because I just think the conversation is very is candid and reflects things that we both want to impart to people and patients, right? Like I think a lot of what you've stated so far is lifestyle based and no quick fixes, no easy solutions, which are not what people want to hear. It's not the exciting part of medicine or therapy that, hey, you have this problem, buckle up for the next 6 months. We're going to start dealing with it. No one wants to hear that, right? But the reality is it's more authentic, and it's what we do throughout all of our different facets of life. You want to improve in any individual facet of life, and it's going to require buckling up and putting together a plan and sticking to the plan and redirecting when that's necessary at the same time. So therefore, we haven't gone to social work. Although I think maybe this is I might have to owe you. This might have been a session. I'm not sure. We'll figure it out. But you said you switched from teaching to social work and going back to school. So something I wanted to discuss was that transition point is I imagine an exceptionally tough transition point, even if it's something you decided to do. I remember speaking when I was going through my process, pre-med, medical. I always describe black holes in my life, right? Meaning that when you go into medical school, which medical school? Where are you going to live? What is that going to look like? When you change your rotations, well, what does this schedule look like? When you go into residency, which specialty am I going to practice? Which they're very, very different in clinical practice. Do you spend your entire day, 10 days in 10 hours a day in an operating room, or, speaking to someone across a desk, right? Where you match, it's not, you don't get to choose your first job, right? There's a match system. So you might interview at a place and put it as number 7, but ultimately that's where you ended up because that's how the match worked. So all of these different facets led to like months of a gaping hole of what does my life look like? And certainly, post residency, career wise, I can promise you this wasn't in the picture at that point, right? But it's here now. Yeah. So I'm curious for your transition, what did that black hole look like and how did you deal with that?
Right. Yeah. It's a great question. So when I decided that I was going to go into social work, so I went to a few places and I ended up choosing Yeshiva University, Wurzweiler, great program.
My alma mater. I mean, not Wurzweiler, but Yeshiva University, yeah.
Great program, great professors. They just, I felt, when I went there for an interview, I felt a sense of caring and they wanted me to succeed, which was great. It was a lot. It was a lot because I was teaching still. I was working. I have a family, Kanai Nahara, and social work. There's you got to work as well as an intern, and then you have to write a lot of papers, right? And coming from the yeshiva system, I didn't really write a lot of papers, but thank God, my wife was able to hold up the fort during those 2 years. It was very intense. I did a summer block program, which is basically most of my courses were in the summer. So I was a teacher. I also happened to have a day camp. Me and a friend of mine ran a day camp for 7 years. And so that was also a balancing act to run the day camp in the summer while I was doing the courses. And I did I think the first year was 5 courses, which was way too much. It was a lot to write so many papers, 5 different courses. Then the following summer was 4, and the following summer was 4. And then during the year was like each semester was 1 or 2 courses. I can't recall exactly. But yeah, it's a big undertaking. And in my head, I was debating, okay, what should I do? I want to go into social work, I want to go into therapy, but it's going to be a lot of work. It's going to be 2 years of intense work. And one of the ways I was able to overcome that was I told myself, okay, once I get my degree, my master's degree, then I'll be able to work with these skills that I now learned and help other people for, however many years Hashem gives me. And so that was very comforting to be able to help me go through those 2 years. And the support of my wife and my children was very helpful, extended family. And yeah, it's rough when you go to school when you're 20 years old or 22. It's very different than when you go to school when you're older and you have a family already. But Baruch Hashem, it was a big bracha. I'm very thankful that I was able to do it, to go through the school, and here I am.
We had Dr. Durman on an earlier episode and a discussion, and he similarly went back for medical school after he'd started a family. And I remember, I was married, but I didn't have kids. I had my first child, second year of medical school, and that was way ahead of a lot of my peers. I mean, certainly you have non-traditional medical applicants who are already a little bit deeper into their lives, but a lot of them didn't have spouses, certainly didn't have kids. And I remember the stress of starting a family and thank God, and then also having another child in residency when, once again, most people still are not married, still not with, and having the stress of working a mixed schedule of nights and days and afternoons, and a baby not respecting that time, right? They're going to cry when they're going to decide to cry.
Babies are selfish for a reason.
Yeah.
They need to be.
Yeah, exactly. So I remember that process, and I think about how I don't know how I could have started it after everything had, all of my life had developed. So I'm always in awe of people who make that transition. I think that's pretty unique and special.
There's always, it's essential to have a lot of support in different ways, friends, family, spouse, but they're saying that when you really, really want something, nothing's going to stand in your way. And there's an exception to that. For example, no matter how much wrestling I have, I'll never be a basketball player in what is it called? The NBA, right? No matter what. So it has to be obviously realistic. But once it's realistic and there's a pathway there, then the Ratzin kicks in and nothing's going to stop you if you have that Ratzin, if you have that will. And The thing is with willpower is that sometimes, and this is debatable, but sometimes we have a limit at each day, right? As they say about self-control, there's studies about that. Like, how much self-control do you have each day? And does it get diminished as you move along? And so if you need it for certain areas, let's say for work or for home, and then suddenly you come to a situation and you're depleted. And so making sure that you have enough to be able to manage everything, that's where the supports come in. Having the supports that allows you to have that routine directed to whatever you want to accomplish.
Wow, that's beautiful. And speaking of how beautiful that is, right? Because there are social workers out there, and we haven't really defined social work yet, but we're going to get there before part 2, I promise. And then there are Ravs out there, and there's a rabbi. But blending both of them, I imagine there is an opportunity to pull on different wisdoms, obviously a chachma of the general world, but also obviously from the Torah, from our tradition, right? Mm-hmm. And that's like a unique opportunity. At the same time, I imagine you don't want to, depending on who you're interacting with, you don't want to come off too preachy. I don't imagine preaching as a productive form of therapy. But you also have a whole nother tool bag, so to speak, to pull from. So how have you noticed that interplay of being a Rav and being in that world, but also a social worker? I imagine it puts you at like a notch above. Sorry, I'm putting you on a pedestal. You didn't do it. I did it. All right. But I imagine it's super helpful for your clients and your patients. So how have you noticed that interplay in reality?
Yeah. So I like when it came to teaching, I would tell teachers, I say, a teacher can use the skills of a therapist. But a therapist shouldn't use the skills of a teacher, because that's not what a therapist is meant to do. We're not meant to discipline, form the child. Really, the patient knows best when it comes to therapy. Likewise with a Rav in therapy. So as a Rav, of a community, I could use the skills from social work and from therapy to apply them to my rabbinic position and to the communities that I serve. But the flip side is not so simple. Meaning using the rabbinic hat in therapy is really frowned upon. If there's a patient who wants to delve into the spiritual dimension, that's different than like getting a halachic ruling or like a question for a dayan. So a lot of times in therapy, I may want to like tell them the answer, and say, but instead I tell them you got to ask your dayan, because it's not my role right now to be your dayan. My role is to be your therapist. And that's sometimes a challenge for me as an individual, but it's best for the patient, for the client, that they have their dayan that they go to. And sometimes it's challenging because sometimes the questions that they have are very uncomfortable to ask a dayan, especially if it's a dayan that you know. And so sometimes I'll connect them to a dayan that I happen to know from the Chassidish world, who they'll feel comfortable asking because they don't really know that dayan, and therefore they'll ask the question. But I refrain from giving answers, because that's not my role as a therapist. My role as a therapist is to help the patient grow and actualize their values and what they want to change in their life, behaviorally, psychologically, emotionally. And it's two different, sometimes it'll overlap. So sometimes I'll use like a story from the Gemara, and I'll ask permission usually before, and if I could share a story in the Gemara, from the Gemara or from Medrash, but I won't bring in any rabbinics or any like halachas or what should or shouldn't into therapy, because that's not my place.
That's got to be exceptionally difficult.
At times.
Yeah, I mean, the level of self-control to, once again, you're bifurcating, you're splitting in some ways your brain of what you have knowledge of and think could help, but is maybe slightly inappropriate in this particular setting for you to portray that information, although you do think it's helpful, and just trying to keep that social work hat on, where you are trying to guide as much as you can, but knowing that there's this information here that could help. I mean, that dialectic, if you will, that two non-communicative components that are, left hemisphere, right hemisphere going on at the same time, that's got to be exceptionally difficult. But to have that awareness is huge, right? I imagine that everyone has a different level of skill in what they do, and I'm sure there are many people who wouldn't have that level of intention as they're discussing with a client or a patient, to make sure that they're not inadvertently kind of intruding from one area of their knowledge into their therapy session. So that's very impressive by you, obviously, and very, very. I think it resonates with me, because when I'm acting as a physician in a room, it's the same thing where patient autonomy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I can give options, I can have a sense of what the best thing is, I can even make a recommendation. But you, like you said, you have to, this is, if someone chooses another pathway, you have to respect that choice. And even if I have thoughts in my head of no, I don't think you should do that. Like that's why we have these principles in place, so
Right.
that you could restrict yourself into something that might be beneficial, but at the end of the day, this is where the line is, and this is what being a professional looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any, but on the same train of thought, are there any, resources that you use that are valuable, either strictly Judaic, or maybe things like, Viktor Frankl's A Man's Search for Meaning, some deep spiritual work that does influence how you speak to your patients? Because obviously you're well versed in wellness
Right.
and health and that kind of stuff. So I'm curious what kind of those influences you have in your life.
So there's no question that my learning and my being a Frumid and learning Torah influences how I think. It becomes one, and the learning and my seichel becomes one. And so when you learn something, there's a yichud she'ein kamoyo, there's a unity between what you learned and between yourself, that there's nothing like that. And so there's no question that Torah influences me tremendously. When it comes to therapy, it's how am I helping the patient? So let's say, like, for example, I'll do values exploration. Like, I want to know, what are your values? What's important to you? Not what's important to me, because that's not going to help you, but what's really important to you? And there's different ways to help a client, a person, come to that list of values of what's important, number 1, 2, and 3. And the benefit of that is because a lot of struggles people have is the disalignment of actions and values. So we say that we have these values, and we believe we have these values, but then when we look at our actions in our life, they're not aligned. And that brings about a feeling of inadequate, or of depression or anxiety. And so we do a lot of values exploration. That's one of the things you do. But as for influencing the therapy room, it's really, as I said, I'll use sometimes stories or anecdotes from Chazal, with permission of the patient. I always ask beforehand if I may share something from Chazal. But it's not about me telling them anything. It's me, like, I'm exploring, I'm discovering, I'm meant to be curious about your life and ask you, what do you want? How do you imagine the best life that you could have, and what's holding you back from getting there? And what are the steps you could take? Because really, the individual, the person, knows really best for themselves. It's just there's certain manias v'ikuvim, things that are holding them back. And once you're able to pull those away, or get rid of those manias v'ikuvim, the patient is able then to move forward. And so it's really figuring out with the patient what they really want. It's not my place to tell them what they should or shouldn't do.
Are there any, obviously you have a background in Chabad, right?
Right.
I mean, that's obvious, right? Actually, there was, my beard was getting a little bit long.
Some people suspected maybe.
And patient, I think I trimmed it a little bit, and then I saw a patient, between the trim, before the trim and after the trim, and he looked at me, he said, I thought you were Chabad. And I was like, all right. I wasn't sure how to take that comment, but yeah, it's not
the trick.
I probably somewhere ancestrally, I'm sure I have some Lubov in me somewhere.
Right.
But as someone who wears it on your sleeve, so to speak, or on your beard, and right, how you dress, how has that influenced, obviously being a Rav, but more importantly, social work? Because you do try and bifurcate, but I imagine there, like you said, there's a unity, there's wells of wisdom there that, at the very least, create a special emotional intelligence, which is probably what makes you an excellent social worker in that regard too. I imagine a very bad social worker is someone who has very little emotional intelligence or self-awareness, right? How could you help someone else with their values and their goals if one doesn't understand themselves? I think I'm making this up, once again, comments below if I'm wrong, but if, like a psychologist has to go to be psychoanalyzed, right? Like you have to have a firm sense of yourself before you are practicing on other people. But how has that also influenced the way that you look at social work and the way that you perform it?
Yeah, so Chabad's mantra is obviously Israel the ultimate, right? To love every single person, every single Jew. And yeah, there's the element of bringing them close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the question is how to do that. And so in a Chabad house, a shliach, there's that mode and that way of bringing somebody closer to Yiddishkeit. And so each their own. Everyone has their own shlichus. And so as a therapist, it's not my tafkid, just like as a doctor, to change a person or change their values. My being there is to help them be the best that they can be in what they value the most. And sometimes it'll be challenging, right? Sometimes I'll have like a patient a person who's telling me about not putting on tefillin, and in my drawer I have sodium tefillin. Right? I have like, let's just wrap it, but no.
Your brain's exploding as
right, and it's very tempting, but no, it's like that's out of frame, and that's not appropriate as a therapist. Right. If they value putting on tefillin, so then I'll talk to them. Okay, it's not my place to put on tefillin now. Maybe if I see them in Manhattan and I happen to ask them, right? I don't go to Manhattan anyway. But so there's that aspect, that challenge that exists. But the whole Chabad philosophy is about the well-being, not just the ruchnius, but the gashmius well-being of another person. And so really focusing on the other person's well-being, emotional, psychological, spiritual, physical well-being, not just the spiritual, but also the physical well-being of the individual. And so that in therapy, that's really big, because that's what you're trying to help. You're working on helping the person feel good psychologically, so they can be, again, the whole idea is that the people want to function optimally, right? When someone has a diagnosis, whatever that diagnosis is or disorder, it's saying that they're not functioning optimally. It's something that's holding them back. And they're coming to therapy to be able to work on that, to be able to overcome that, to now be able to function the best way that they see fit. And that's the job of a therapist, is to help people overcome their challenges and tribulations, process trauma. Trauma, could do a whole segment on trauma, but the idea is
we will.
The idea, like post-traumatic stress disorder, it's called a disorder because it's supposed to be post, but it becomes present, and that's the challenge. And so there's many different ways how to process it. That should be a past experience that doesn't. There's no visceral effect when you tell over the story or when you think about it. And so helping people overcome these difficulties and these challenges makes them a better human being to do the things that they value.
I use heuristics every day when I practice, these small little idioms, lines that you can reflect on that help you practice in an optimal way. Are there any that, just example for me is, with great power comes great responsibility. Mm-hmm. It's a quote from the culture out there. But to me, it's a reminder, right, that I have a lot of power in my role as a physician. And if you have power, that's not something to take advantage of. That's a time to reflect on the responsibility. And that's always something when I'm speaking with residents, medical students, when I work with PAs. That's the message I try to imbue, because I think like Tovim Shebarofim Gehenim Ninu, right? That if you don't recognize the responsibility of power, that's how you go down potentially the wrong track of being a clinician. Is there anything that you rely on a daily basis that kind of is, your balance point in practicing social work?
All right, good question. There's nothing that comes to mind per se of like a passage or a word, but recognizing that it says Kol HaMakayim Nefesh Achas MiYisrael Kiyu Kilum Oilam Mali, and it means whoever helps keep alive a Nefesh Achas MiYisrael, a Jewish person, individual, as if a whole world was sustained. And that's something that I think about here and there, is that every person is a Oilam Katan, is a complete world. And when you impact one person, it's not just one person. You're impacting many, many other systems, many, many other worlds. And so that if there's one phrase that I think about, it would be that one, the famous Maimer Chazal of being Mekayim Nefesh Achas MiYisrael, and helping people. And when one person is helped, it's not just one person. So again, it's intergenerational, right? So there's something called intergenerational trauma. But when you're able to stop that process, if one person gets helped, that now that trauma shouldn't continue onwards to the next generation. And so it helps when one person is helped, then the marriage is helped, then the family is helped, the whole systems, the family systems, the community, the work environment, friends. So there's many different systems that are impacted when one person gets the help that they need and desire. Beautiful.
I also think there's a song, going back to the beginning of our discussion, I can't remember the tune for it, but there's a song on that phrase. But it's a beautiful phrase. It's kind of the same way when I practice medicine, that if you view a person as a world, then obviously you'll you have a heightened level of, once again, responsibility, right? The worst thing that we can do in medicine is belittling the individual in front of us, right? And saying that they're not the world, or because they're in a particular predicament, that they're not valuable in a way that someone else is valuable, right? I mean, that would be the worst thing you could possibly do in a session, right? Obviously, is devaluing the person in front of you. You have to elevate them and recognize the significance of every single individual, especially the individuals that are coming to you in such a for oftentimes sensitive situations, right?
Yeah,
very vulnerable.
Yeah. Another one comes to mind is Havedanas called them kafschus. So it's so easy for the brain to be judgmental. And that's what the brain does, I think, by default, right? It sees something, it doesn't see the whole picture, but it judges based on what it sees. And the truth of the matter is that we don't really know the whole picture when we just see something. And so when a patient comes, a client or individual comes to me, it's very easy for a person to be judgmental, like, how could you have done that? Or like questions about it. But the reality is that we don't understand what someone went through. And when you hear a story of what someone went through, you're like, oh my goodness, wow, how do you survive that? How do you manage? How do you become what you are today with all that you experienced? And so really Havedanas called them kafschus, not being judgmental. And that's what, fundamental in therapy is not to be judgmental of another person, because we don't really know what the person went through unless we stand in their shoes, and we can't stand in their shoes. We could try to, understand and have empathy, but we can't really live what they lived through. And so not being judgmental is a big one.
I don't think we've spoken a word about social work truly yet. But Rabbi Moshe Wiener, this has been a pleasure. This is only part one, so we're going to have to label it as such. You don't even know what time it is?
I don't.
You got to run out of here.
What time is it?
It's 12:51.
Really?
Yeah, behind the curtain.
Oh my goodness.
You thought it was a half hour, and here we are.
I thought it was 5 minutes.
Yeah, the hope is that everyone who listens feels the same way, but who knows about that.
There's always double speed.
I only listen at 1.5, so if anyone's listening to this on one, change it immediately. No less than 1.25 or 1.5 if you can manage it. But it's an absolute pleasure. I think beyond getting to know about social work, which I think we'll figure out in part two,
Right.
Getting to know the person behind the social worker is just as important, if not more important, based off of this discussion that we had. And I appreciate the insights that I've gained. The fluidity in which you're able to quote passages and explain them, how meaningful they are in everyday life is remarkable, is enjoyable. I probably owe you money after the session, and I appreciate you coming in today and being on the Eyes Health podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Shkoyach.